Byron, I hate to say it, but we were right. The so-called Putin fanboys, you and I, have been completely right about what the sanctions on Russia and the consequences of those sanctions, not on Russia itself, but on the rest of the world. And it's not looking good at all for Western Europe.
No. When we raised the point, and I know this is going to happen now, we're going to raise the point that this war was never going to impact Russia in the way that everybody suggested it would. Everybody was like, oh, Putin stooges. How can you say that? Or are you saying that it's right to invade a foreign country? And, it's kind of like the old polemic. You can't say something exists without de factoing meaning everything else that you actually never drew reference to anyway. The matter of the fact is, it doesn't matter what our view is on Ukraine. And yeah, you shouldn't invade your neighbors. That's not really a good look, is it? So, we don't think Russia should have done that. However, we also don't think that the attack was unprovoked, and we did a whole documentary on it where we actually interviewed the Russian ambassador to South Africa on it, and we talked to him about it. It was not without reason, and funnily enough, one of the reasons that were highlighted was actually around Western aggression and the idea of NATO expansion, which is a fact. It's something everybody understands.
Yep.
But the consequences of that, we were told, were basically worth paying. Isn't that what we were told? And the consequences of that at the time, we said, are going to be a lot dire than everybody was suggesting. And it's a lot further down the line. And it turns out that we were unfortunately proved right.
Yeah, and it's not a question of the consequences of dire for Russia. No, they are dire for Western Europe in general. And Tulsi Gabbard, who is a Democrat for some reason, but who is pretty based, and I like her quite a lot, she had a bit of a minute and a half explanation of what is happening in Europe, and I think it's worth our while to watch it fully, and then we'll give our comment to it in a moment.
Mhm.
Europe is in a massive energy crisis right now, with the price of electricity in France just hitting record highs. Their government is ordering businesses to cut back on the use of illuminated signs and advertising. In Berlin, Germany, they're turning off non-essential traffic lights at night. Millions could be without heat this winter. In Spain, it's now illegal in some places to put your AC below 80 degrees Fahrenheit. The UK is bracing for wide-scale blackouts this winter. Why is all this happening? Because of Joe Biden's sanctions that are nothing short of a modern-day siege. Now, this comes at a great cost, but Joe Biden told us, hey, this is necessary to defend Ukraine.
Defending freedom will have cost for us as well, and here at home. We need to be honest about that. But as we do this, I'm going to take robust action to make sure the pain of our sanctions is targeted at the Russian economy, not ours.
Now, there are costs for us, but it's not Joe Biden paying the price. Vladimir Putin is not either. Russia's energy revenue is higher now than before the war in Ukraine began. This is a supply problem that Joe Biden created, one that Russia is now profiting from. There is no cost, no amount of death, destruction, and suffering that'll get in the way of permanent Washington fulfilling their agenda. Now, remember former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright? And she said that 500,000 dead Iranians.
Sorry, so she goes on to do other things and say other things, but essentially you get the issue here. And the issue here is that the sanctions aren't working, guys. The sanctions on Russia is not working at the slightest because inflation in Russia is extremely low to non-existent, whereas inflation in Europe and other places in the world, inflation is at sky-high records, right? Thanks to the very sanctions imposed on Russia by the US. I mean, the blowback was obvious from the get-go, and we were called all sorts of names for stating that. But here you go, my friend. This is why things are the way they are.
Yeah, so I think it would be useful, Ramon. Let's actually look at some practical terms of this because we can talk about this and we'll dissect some of what she said in a second. But let's actually look at what this looks like as consequences.
Yeah.
So the last week there was an article that was done in Britain, and it basically gave a graphic of what's happening between the United Kingdom in terms of pricing to what's actually happening in Russia. Have you loaded it, mate?
It's been there for like a minute, mate. Way ahead of you.
Cool. Okay, so basically what you'll see is that the prices in the UK are all up quite a lot, and the prices in Russia are kind of down. The biggest one is obviously energy at 80% increase. And if you've been anywhere near any of the British news over the last however long, good few weeks now, there's a lot of businesses saying that they are going to be closing. And a lot of the reasons for these businesses are that they're very intensive on electricity. They might be manufacturing. They're not what we would class as the laptop class. They're manufacturing businesses. They're businesses that have fans or fridges or something like that. And a lot of them are now being quoted bills of hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of pounds for the year. And they're just saying it's not possible. I mean, they've already gone through lockdowns. There's a lot of very famous pubs now in London as well. So there's a number of pubs in London and around the UK, full stop, that have been there for hundreds of years. Some of them have been there for nearly 200 years, and they're closing their doors because they're just saying it's becoming uneconomical to actually heat those places. And obviously the UK is now going into winter, so it's going to need heating. So it's a bit of a sad state of affairs. You know, I suppose you could say, well, go off and get solar for your house. It's the UK, mate. There's no bloody sun.
In the UK,
so,
there's no sun, and
you know,
unfortunately for the West. So, for example, a lot of people are saying, well, you know, why is France experiencing sky high energy bills? Well, because their nuclear power stations, they are basically in a drought. They turn them off because they're in a drought at the moment. There's not enough water to recycle through the system, so they are also sucking up huge amounts of energy bills. And it's not going to get any better because Russia has come out to say that, well, we're not going to turn on Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which is the main pipeline for gas to Germany, most importantly, until the sanctions are lifted. The American sanctions imposed by the EU, until they are lifted, Europe is not going to get gas this winter. And now, I don't know about
you know what I don't...
but the main reason my ancestors moved to Africa was for the weather, because the weather in Europe is quite shite, especially in winter, and especially with no heating.
Correct. It's 100% the reason there. And I'm sure I've said this to you before, but nobody ever said I'm moving to the UK because I love the weather. It just never happened in the history of humanity.
Yeah.
You know, and it's funny that if you look at the Turkish Empire was one of the largest empires ever to expand throughout, you know, Asia and Europe, and it was amazingly powerful. But there was a certain point where the Turkish Empire got so far in Europe and it just stopped. And part of the reason for that was because they got to parts of Europe where the weather was just shit, and they were like, "I'm not leaving Turkey for this crap." So, you know, weather is a really big thing when it comes to general people's well-being. But with that being said, I think the biggest problem that I foresee or I see at the moment with this whole energy crisis is that a lot of people are saying, well, we're not importing Russian gas, we're not importing Russian crude, which means that's why the cost of things are going up. But you see, Ramon, it's a lie. It's actually a lie, because that's not actually what's occurring. And the reason the prices are going up isn't because you don't have the supply. Have you noticed how there's still petrol for your car? Why do you think that is? The cost has gone up, but supply is still there. And the answer is actually very, very, very clear. And that is, the Russians are still selling their stuff, but they're selling it to China. Yeah. China's adding a markup and selling it to the West. And in doing so, the price just went up to the West. So the West is buying Russian oil, but they're buying it from the Chinese who got a markup, and the Russians are still getting paid. Now, here's the problem. And you tell me if you disagree. Who's a bigger threat? China or Russia? Because I think China.
Yeah, definitely China. Well, I mean, they've got economic issues now which may threaten the entire global hegemonic goals. But yes, China is definitely the biggest problem for the West. I'm not like necessarily anti-China as much as I used to be, at least. But yes, I mean, one would hope that the West would be like, you know, China is a bigger threat here, so we shouldn't empower them in any way. So what we're going to do is sanction Russia completely, and then force Russia to sell that, what they sold to us, sell it to China, and then China will sell it back to us for 40% more. Because, I mean, that's the best way to make sure China never overtakes you as an economy.
Absolutely. And
It's so
once they've got
dumb.
all of our money that we gave to them for free, because we didn't
Yes.
have to buy from the Chinese, like the Chinese aren't doing anything, they're just facilitating us as a broker. And it's like, yeah, China has some free money. I know it's our money, but yeah, have some money. And by the way, please don't get too big and powerful that you might threaten us. Because that's the other part of this, isn't it?
Yeah.
America's so scared at China and Russia in terms of their global position, and especially with their partnership, that they feel the need to continue to expand NATO in order to be able to bully those that don't follow like NATO type orders. So it's like, okay, let's continue to expand that group because these guys might get too powerful. We might need them to subdue these guys. By the way, you, my enemy, I know we can't use the enemy anymore because that's not a PC term, my less cooperative neighbor, here, have all of my money. Like, it just seems stupid, man.
And
You got to think, like,
yeah.
where's the thinking?
And it's all over the invasion of Ukraine, which we're not in favor of. But in terms of invasions, you've had about 5,000 deaths, I think civilian deaths since February.
Yeah.
It's now August. I think we've had more murders in South Africa in that time than there's been deaths in the
I think
war
so, yeah.
zone in Ukraine. And secondly, Ukraine is a shithole country, guys. Like, really, it's like one of the most corrupt countries in the world. It's a country that is filled with human trafficking and sex slavery and all sorts of awful things like Nazis and whatever else. And this is like the hill the West wants to die on, right? And it's not, we know very well it's not about Ukraine. It's not about Ukraine at all. It's about trying to screw Russia over. But it's just not working. And these Western leaders who are, democratically elected are like, we will, trust Ukraine and support Ukraine to the nth degree just to screw over Russia. And they're not suffering. It's the people suffering. It's the ordinary citizens suffering. It's the ordinary business people in Europe suffering.
Yeah.
But how does this make sense to anyone? I have absolutely no idea whatsoever, except for Putin. He's like, yeah, the Western Europeans are quite dumb. And I think he's absolutely correct when he says that, if he does say that.
So when we interviewed the Russian ambassador to South Africa, which if you haven't watched it, guys, go watch it. It's a good video. One of the things that was mentioned there was actually around Ukrainian Nazis, and we did discuss it. And we got a lot of pushback to that video because there was a number of people that said, how could Ukraine have Nazis? Zelensky's a Jew. Like, there's no ways that they could have it. And I think what's really funny is that, I don't know if you saw this on the weekend, but Peter Hitchens in the Daily Mail in the UK wrote an article that basically says, Ukraine has a Nazi problem. There's a lot of Nazis in Ukraine. And you're like, oh, we're only accepting this now. How many months later? I mean, that was one of the pretexts for war. And it does seem like the more time that goes by, everything that was said from the Russian side has proved to be true. And everything that we said that were going to be the consequences has proved to be true. And yet, we're still sending money and weapons to Ukraine, mate. So, I don't know. Where's the logic?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of Western European countries will gladly sacrifice everything they can on the altar of trying to screw Russia over. Because, I mean, at the end of the day, Byron, we need gay rights in the Ukraine. We absolutely need them. And therefore, if you're a business and you're paying £10,000 a year for gas when before you paid 1,000, it's worth it for gay rights in Ukraine because that's the most important thing to the global American empire.
I don't know, man. I don't know. I think the whole thing is just a massive screw up, and it's funny to watch Putin actually do some conferences on this. He himself says that he also can't understand why the Western Empire is so intent on this. He also says, these guys seem to actually have lost their marbles a little bit. And if you've listened to Mr. Joe Biden talk of recent, I mean, his very famous speech last week has cemented this view from me, where he said, what we need in this country is we need unity. We need unity of purpose. We need everybody to come together and work together, which is why if you're the 50% of the country that voted for Donald Trump, you're an extremist, you're a racist, and you are a terrorist. Nothing unifies you like being called a terrorist, mate. And they did go and ask his press secretary and say, are you sure that that's what he meant to say? And she said, Of course he did, because, if you're not following what we're saying, and what we're saying is what everybody thinks. I mean, okay, only 50% of you kind of voted for us, but that's by the bar. Anyway, if you're not following what we say, that makes you an extremist. So, I mean, that's proper unifying, mate. You're either with me or you're against me. If you're against me, the unifying, good, peaceful thing to do would be to exterminate you. So,
Welcome to the global American empire, my friend. Let's destroy our own countries through high bills by sanctioning Russia. And then while we have all this anxiety around the cost of living, we're just going to call each other terrorists till, Putin just nukes all of us and puts us out of all our misery. I think that's the way to go.
But you got to look at this and then just go, and then these people are kind of like expecting you to trust them, man. Trust them, man. Come on, man. Trust them. And it's like, they're expecting you to believe that when they're talking to you about why they're doing what they're doing with the Russians, whilst calling you a terrorist and telling you you're an extremist if you don't want to cut little girls' breasts off or something, like, because you don't follow the agenda. I don't know, man. Call me a Putin fanboy if I'm skeptical on this, because global American empire, man.
I mean, we don't love Russia, but we really hate the global American empire. I mean, I think that's fair enough, right? But we don't support enemies of the global American empire. But we just know it's like uniquely quite evil what the Americans are doing to the world. And, if they destroy themselves by pursuing it, then maybe they should pursue it even more. With that, thank you for watching, everyone. We will see you very, very soon. Have a good one.
Take it easy. Cheers. Bye.